Hello, everyone. Uh, Joining me is Post-Comprehension. He is an anarcho-transhumanist content creator on YouTube. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Post-Comprehension, otherwise known as Being. I make anarchist, transhumanist, and other such content. And I am here to talk about Russia, Ukraine, and fascism, more specifically, whether or not Russia counts as fascist.
Yeah, and I'm also going to be, for my part, going to be going over um, some of the a kind of what I think is a overview of the conflict, um, or the history leading up to it. Um, so uh, yeah, I'm going to let Being go first, and talk about and go over the things he wants to talk about and go over.
All right. All right. So, no world leader is seemingly without immunity to the accusations of fascism thrown their way, and certainly Vladimir Putin is by and large no exception to this, and is in fact a common source for finger pointing when you ask someone to name a current fascist leader. In fact, more specifically, when speaking about Russia and its fascist criteria, it's common to summon an infamous debate between two inane sides. One side which views Western liberalism as in conflict with Russia's quote unquote fascism, and the other which views Russia Russia's anti-fascism against Western renewed fascism. This black and white view offers no use other than to justify strategic narratives on either side. Russia uses the latter to generate cultural consensus at home to try and whip up favorability towards its regime and its actions both at home and abroad. When Russia uses this narrative on the international scene, it's used to justify itself as having a legitimate say in European security. Invoking the Soviet. When Russia uses. Invoking the Soviet Union's part in the 1945 victory against Nazi Germany as a historical precedent. To quote Marlene L'Oreal in Is Russia Fascist more directly at the end of this bit here. By calling its enemies fascist, the Russian regime describes its own understanding of the international system, offering a storyline that puts the Russian people and its values and goals at the center of a plot. Another strategic narrative, ideologically in reverse but performing the exactly same function, is displayed by all those who denounce Russia as fascist. Through it, they frame their own version of the world, identify adversaries, and position themselves on a moral high ground. From this, it's interesting to observe how fascism as a buzzword is used in international politics to construct justifications for national actions both domestically and abroad, justifying power relations on both the international and national scenes, adding to the weight this word has as a pejorative in the post-war era. However, these claims are misleading, reductionist, and harm our understanding of how authoritarian politics has changed since the end of the fascist era in 1945. When we accuse a dictator of fascism, what we're doing is invoking a broad and unhelpful framing around them that shields further discussion. This is especially the case when we haven't firmly established a contained yet fluid definition for what fascism is and how to exactly identify it. As people familiar with Being will know, the definition Being uses is Roger Griffin's and will be used as a measuring rod of sorts for investigating Russia's potential as a fascist state. Being has done 2 videos explaining his method, but we'll try to quickly reiterate and repackage the definition sort of as quickly as possible here. The definition is a genius of political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. This unpacked in a bit of a quick form is fascism is a form of revolutionary organic nationalism that seeks a new rooted order founded on the internal elements of the nation's past rather than the literal restoration of it. through the mobilization of those organic members. So palingenesis rebirth here should be seen as a new birth rather than some reactionary, conservative, or liberal call towards a broad sense of past greatness. With this generic type in mind, we move on. We move on to comparing states and their regimes to Weimar Germany, which is a common exercise in popular politics. This is done to invoke a sense of coming doom that an authoritarian similar to Adolf Hitler will take over said country and transform it in a similar way, or it's to compare an already established authoritarian and say this transformation is happening or in the process of happening. This type of comparison is done in contemporary politics to reduce the nuances between the two different points in history. But comparisons don't have to be this way. In fact, we could use this comparison as a highlight the differences and nuances instead of removing them. Weimar Germany had a well-developed party system as opposed to Russia, where in Russia, paternal mechanisms help to prevent ideological polarization. A lack of well-organized civil society exists in Russia compared to the Weimar Germany, helps to illuminate where any similarities between them end. The general point drawn from this is to compare the primary difference here of Putin's use of electoralism in Russia to become and sustain presidency over the background of a perpetuated multi-party system that, while abused, has yet to be removed. To add some historical stuff, the 1993 December parliamentary election saw Vladimir Volynsky, who gained 23% of the votes, not become Hitler, but rather become a useful asset in keeping up the theatrics of pleasing the technicality of having party opposition while not actually threatening the status quo. So, with Putin's presidency in the year 2000, although acting president in 1990, served not as a fascist dictator, but rather a part of a newer trend of authoritarianism. Someone who doesn't outright remove opposition parties completely, who doesn't dismantle constitutions and proclaim a new state ideology, but rather his regime is contained within the current order, but at the same time will abuse, test, and mend the technicalities that exist in it. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Volynsky is useful in maintaining this whole configuration as a useful presentation of party opposition, even though he is known for consistently supporting the status quo generally. This means the illiberalization of the electoral system through single-party domination politics and mass media controls under the official banner of a multi-party democracy. Many terms have I see the image you're showing. Many terms have appeared to describe this as an electoral autocracy, competitive authoritarianism, and patronal regime, but the terms being preferred are illiberal democracy and illiberal democrat. No matter the term for this, however, it's all generally used to describe a situation of politically existing between liberal multi-party democracy and outright official single-party domains. Not that an officially single-party state is necessarily fascist either. The state building involved in a illiberal democracy is to build a wedge between the liberal and the democratic, the implementation of authoritarian practices with the motive, goal, and overall aim of mediating divergent interest groups while balancing the need for popular support recognitions through co-creational mechanisms and elections. Hitler's rise to power, at the other end of this two-point historical comparison, resulted in the end of multi-party politics, liberal and overall Republican constitutionalism, and the transformation of the German state into a mobilized vehicle to try and establish the rebirth and sustain the supposed greatness of the quote-unquote Aryan nation through a temporal revolution against liberal modernity for a rooted one. Interestingly, Putin in particular differs from the more recent illiberal Democrats in regards to populism. An illiberal Democrat will proclaim a type of populism or a non-populist position from the standpoint of the existing status quo, as is Putin's case, with a type of nation-statism against international and foreign influences, which are posed as the elite or rival elite, invoking the appearance of retaking domestic priority against those influences abroad. This captures the political support from the many on the far right to even lesser far-right conservatives who felt alienated from the democratic process. For example, Trump was able to capture modern paleo-conservatives, fascist, and other alt-right groups while abstaining from a utopian vision or revolutionary politics so as to attract those lesser radical conservative centrists and even pull from the broader crowd of the politically disengaged. Similar to how Trump was able to pull from the far right without subscribing to a radical vision and worldview, Putin will often draw ideas from the many bedfellows he shares with Alexander Dugin, while Dugin is a fascist. However, the ethnic and national beliefs Putin invokes or pulls at are removed from their fascist content and instead dragged into simply perpetuating the illiberal democracy he has domains over by the time they arrive at his lips. This is to sustain the balancing act we described earlier, of both using authoritarianism but keeping it in line with democratic technicalities. To quickly use another quote, contrary to frequent media statements, Dugin's theories are not the direct inspiration for Putin's regime and its quest for great powerness. The Kremlin has not made official any new state ideology inspired by the conservative revolution, even if it borrows some themes from it. However, in Europe, the Kremlin has recently acquired more or less the same allies as Dugin has cultivated for more than 2 decades. As seen from the Kremlin, those who denounce Brussels as technocrats and their submission to U.S. interests are potential friends of Russia. In addition to this geopolitical orientation, the European far right shares with the Russian regime a similar anti-liberal narrative that denounces economic and political modernity, individualism, the destruction of so-called traditional values, and imposition of external cultural standards. But although Dugin and the European far right belong to the same ideological world and can be seen as twins, the alliance between Putin's regime and the European far right is more of a marriage of convenience than one of true love. Another quote from Marlene L'Oreal from a book that multiple writers did called Eurasianism and the European Far Right. Okay, so Putin's usage of nationalism and ethnic ties is a part of a broader plurality of the regime's overall conservative character, as opposed to being a part of some grand vision to seek a rooted modernity. Putin will invoke broad palingenesis and ethnic ties, but as a means to pull it into a conservative and personal regime. Putin's focus on the past, but a lack of clear utopian vision for a future from organic elements, put him in the position of reactionary and not revolutionary ultranationalism. Putin's illiberal democratic status can be applied to his international shenanigans as well, forming a narrative of conservatism as a reaction to excessive liberalism and the mistakes of the US-led order. This inspires the restrictive legislation on family and gender roles, which legitimizes an illiberal civic society, from orthodox activists to Kazakhs and vigilante groups of all sorts at home, but abroad, this is instrumental to Russia's foreign policy of challenging Western dominance. The existence of this narrative and the regime's illiberalism that exists within technicalities can be applied to the current invasion of Ukraine, as this opposition to its NATO membership and use of proxy separatists is an attempt to do imperialism through this method. Of course, even still, the larger international community has condemned this, but has yet to see it as a threat worthy of global war. This is due to the fact that Putin's method allows him to invade without deeper repercussion from the wider international community. Of course, exceptions to this, such as outspoken outrage, trade sanctions, military protection of surrounding NATO members, and indirect military aid to Ukraine. Basically, since Ukraine is not a NATO member, it cannot invoke its laws to call on those other states for help directly. And I'm almost done here. On the other end is Ukraine fascist. No, in fact, arguably, no state today is. People will try to bring up the Azov battalion, but this in itself doesn't make the regime, government, or state fascist. It can instead mean other nuanced things, such as incorporation of a far-right military unit into alignment and subordination to the government's ideological makeup. Since Azov gained government status, many of its former founding members left, and with them its government status as a military unit, its fascist roots became detached and marginal. In the sense that this part of the National Guard is in no position to facilitate a mass mobilization and take over the Ukrainian state. Rather, it's a small part of the National Guard that attracts Ukrainian far right to then serve a non-fascist state. It wasn't uncommon for non-fascist states in the interwar period, if we want to use war and war period examples, as people commonly like to do, there were plenty of non-fascist states that used some sort of fascist movement or alignment within their own makeup, such as the Kuomintang's usage of the Blue Shirt Society, or Franco's usage of the Flang de subsumit under his subordination for his own Othkon goals. However, these examples, of course, are not one-to-one. We, of course, exist in a much different landscape today than they did, but it's just simply the merely being is presenting the idea that a non-fascist political force can use and subordinate a fascist one without that non-fascist force becoming fascist itself. To quote Anton Chekhov in an article he did on the Azov battalion. While the ideological nature of Azov's roots is indisputable, it is likewise certain that Azov's attempted to depoliticize itself. The toxic far-right leadership formally left the regiment and founded what became a far-right party called National Force. And of course, this far-right party that they tried to form only got 2% of the vote and failed miserably. So, and yeah, that's basically Being's statements on my end.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, what I'm gonna talk about is a kind of overview of how we got to this point. I will be writing something that is much more in depth in the coming week, let's say, or a few days, or whatever it ends up being. But I will give you a kind of short and sweet overview here. And if you want to read that eventual in-depth analysis, you can check out my blog, which is in the description. Yeah. So in the past week, Russia invaded Ukraine. There were weeks of speculation and Western foreign policy analysis in the Western media and among Western politicians about Russia staging an invasion. The Russian media and Russian politicians insisted that, in fact, they were just doing staging military operations, and they were not planning any military action. And so if you watched Russia Today, which has a YouTube channel, what was said there was basically the idea of an invasion is ridiculous. Yet we have now on our hands what the media was calling beforehand a full-scale invasion. This distinction of full-scale invasion came was brought in or talked about as a way of distinguishing an actual Russian invasion of Ukraine from Putin's sending of quote-unquote peacekeeping troops to the separatist republics that Russia is backing. So I was actually skeptical myself that Russia was ever going to invade. I thought they wouldn't do it. Well, I didn't believe Putin's stuff about it's this is just certain defensive military operations. Obviously that wasn't true. I thought ultimately Russia's endgame was just a proxy conflict. They'd send some troops to the separatist areas, but they probably wouldn't actually go for a full-scale invasion, in my opinion, at the time. I don't know when it was, like a few days ago, when reports of when I saw the videos of the explosions, I was kind of floored and was, realized, wow, they are actually doing this. The reason I didn't think they'd do this is because mainly because war like this is not something that states can really afford in the era that we've entered, particularly because of hundreds of years of economic so-called globalization that has taken place, and integrated all of the different states of the world into the same supply chains. And so, so I thought Russia would be strategically smart enough to avoid an invasion that would lead to larger world economic problems, and Russia bearing the brunt of much of that. And of course, that is what has resulted. Russia's ruble took a major hit, hitting record lows. The stock market elsewhere has gotten hit. Oil prices have gone up. And because oil prices are going up, that's affecting everything else in the supply chain. So in the coming months, pretty much everything is going to be subject to inflation. And so, I thought Russia would be strategically smart enough to avoid that. I overestimated how smart they were. Or perhaps I underestimated how desperate Russia is. Because Russia obviously has taken action in the way of basically just dealing with the fallout and going ahead anyway. Of course, whenever you get a major geopolitical event like this, the left then scurries to the worst positions possible and fights over which of those positions are in fact the correct positions. So, for instance, of course, you have the Stalinists who have just swallowed Russian propaganda wholesale. Oh, this is a defensive war. This is really NATO's fault. The main job of the left is to oppose Western intervention, but Russian intervention is fine. The separatist republics are fighting an anti-fascist fight. The Ukrainian state is fascist, this and that. And I expected that because that's the same mantra that they've been espousing ever since Russia annexed Crimea.
Right, like I was talking about earlier, there's this international back and forth, sort of like what I call like an international game of hot potato, where each group is accusing each other of fascism to justify its own position and actions.
Yeah. But something that's floored me a little bit more, actually, because I expected the tankies to be, to have these idiotic positions. They always do. They had it with the Syrian civil war. They have it with pretty much every other geopolitical conflict. This is the kind of stance they take. But what floors me more is actually the positions that some anarchists have taken. I've seen and of course, this isn't really the anarchist left on the ground. We're talking about people online, but I've seen anarchists on Twitter with both the black flag in their bios, or not their bios, their usernames, and the Ukrainian flag in their usernames. And so some anarchists have taken on this position that this is like a national liberation struggle where you have to the left needs to support the Ukrainian regime against Russia. And I'm not going to include Vosh in the anarchists because he is not an anarchist. But others like Vosh, leftist streamers, have taken that to the extreme. I guess I guess Vosh is now doing propaganda for the Ukrainian military. Even I'm sure the Ukrainian military did not ask him to do this, but he's doing it, I guess. He is saying that Zelensky is a war hero because he's saying that he'll stay in Kiev. Of course, his actual policy actions have been conceding to Russia. He's trying to get them to the negotiating table by saying, okay, well, we won't join NATO. So that's a little bit overlooked when you talk about him being a war hero because he's going to stay in Kiev. But in any event, and so basically now we have, I guess, this other side of the left. Again, everybody's scrambling to the worst positions possible, and the other side, the other worst position possible, besides swallowing Russian propaganda wholesale, is I suppose getting behind the Ukrainian regime, and at worst, like Vosh has done, calling for NATO sanctions on Russia. Which, by the way, the United States or the West in general has been very tepid with. I mean, the thing is that no one. No one in the West really, really actually wants to do sanctions, because Russia accounts for a good portion of the oil market, and both Russia and Ukraine are in computer technology. So the sanctions have been pretty sparing, and it's mostly just been rhetoric. And I suspect it's probably not going to change. And if sanctions are imposed, it's going to be to the peril of the world economy and to the West. Anyway, again, like with every geopolitical conflict, the left has scrambled to the worst positions possible. And there's also this arrogance about, assuming that the left controls geopolitics. So, the assumption, nobody states this outright, but the assumption seems to be that if you put a Ukrainian flag in your username on Twitter, then you will somehow be fighting in the conflict. You will be affecting it somehow, and the opinions of people on the left, outside of Ukraine, outside of Russia, supposedly matter on this score. They don't. I mean, again, something that the left never understands whenever something geopolitical happens is that the left doesn't control geopolitics. What a Marxist-Leninist or thinks. A Marxist-Leninist in the United States supporting Russia, support just means, saying that Russia is good. Putin doesn't care if Marxist-Leninists in the United States support Russia. That has no bearing on whatever Putin is doing. Likewise, Zelensky and NATO don't care if Bosch makes propaganda for the Ukrainian military. It's completely immaterial to them. None of the opinions of any of these people matter to the people who are actually carrying this stuff out. Now, in order to kind of highlight why I disagree with both of those positions and why I say that they're the worst positions possible, I'm going to give you an overview of the conflict, and kind of spell out what my attitude is towards it and what I think everybody else's attitude should be. Okay, so the story, I think, goes back to the Cold War. Okay, to understand what's happening now, we have to understand the Cold War, and that's because this conflict is directly related to post-Cold War politics. So, if we're going to understand post-Cold War politics, then we have to understand the Cold War. I'm not going to go on length about it, but I'm just going to say a few things. Okay. So yeah, there you see Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin meeting at the Yalta Conference. There were many meetings of the Big Three, as these three were called, like this, after World War II. And these meetings were essentially for the purpose of dividing the post-war world. And so everybody recognizes that around these conferences and meetings, there were a set of informal agreements. Effectively, the informal agreements were that the world would be divided into thirds. 2/3 would go to the West under U.S. control, and 1/3 would go to the Soviet Union under Soviet control. And in Europe, this would be divided along what's called the Oder-Neisse line, and this would extend into the division of the Koreas. Now, the standard narrative is that these agreements fell apart. Okay, in 1948, you have Churchill giving his speech in the United States about the expansion of the Soviet Union and its attempts at world domination. And then the tensions ratchet up between the United States and the Soviet Union under Truman. Then the agreements fall apart, and so what you have is a Cold War. You have an ideological conflict between the United States and its satellites and the Soviet Union and its satellites. This is as well as a conflict of military buildup that includes the buildup of nuclear weapons, such that if anybody fired their nuclear weapons, then there would be retaliation, and basically there would be a nuclear holocaust. And this was called mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. That's the standard narrative. Even scholars hold that narrative. It's the narrative that most people believe. But the narrative wasn't actually kind of developed by scholars from looking at the evidence. It was handed down to scholars by politicians. It was a political narrative first and foremost, and it wasn't a true one. Part of the informal agreements around Yalta, the other part of the informal agreements around Yalta, in fact, there were two other parts. Besides the provision of the division of the world into thirds, there was also a provision about both sides would respect the division. And according to the standard narrative, that part of the agreement would be disrespected the most. But there was also another provision, the other provision of the informal agreements. And again, this isn't necessarily written down anywhere. There wasn't a contract between the United States and the Soviet Union. These are informal agreements that were reached between the states. But we know about them, and everybody recognizes that they exist. But the other provision, the third provision, was that each side would engage in rhetoric against the other. So each side would politically denounce the other. There would be a narrative of ideological conflict, and that would serve not as an actual point of contention between the two sides, but as a way of the two sides mobilizing the forces under them, under their authority, and thus maintaining control over their divided slices of the world. And that part of the informal agreement seems to have been forgotten, because if you analyze what happened in the Cold War, you find that the rhetoric between the two sides essentially functioned in the way the informal agreement said that it should, and both sides respected the division of the world between them. Now, it is the case that there were situations in which there could have been actual conflict that would have rendered the agreements null. So you have the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can throw in the Bay of Pigs if you want. You have the Korean War. You have the Sino-Soviet split. and the East German blockade and so forth. And so there were situations in which the agreements broke down, or could have broke down. But what happened is that both sides, even though things could have escalated, one or the other side stopped an escalation from happening. So in the Korean War, the United States fired or removed General MacArthur from his position as commander of the Korean War because he was essentially willing to go full scale to a nuclear conflict with China, even though he was a very popular military man in the United States. In the Cuban Missile Crisis that ended, as we all know, with Khrushchev writing a letter to Kennedy saying, okay, we now withdraw back to the side of the line that we're supposed to be on. And so with every case of tensions supposedly, or rather tensions actually increasing, and the real possibility for a breakdown of the informal agreements being there, that possibility was I guess the right word is prevented by one or the other side going back behind the line and respecting the agreements. So what you have there is in fact what you have there is in fact a counter to the narrative that we all or most of us believe about the Cold War. It wasn't really a conflict. And so going with that narrative out the window also has to go out the window the narrative of the West being triumphant, winning the Cold War when the Soviet Union collapses. In fact, the United States did not want the Soviet Union to collapse. Of course, the United States swooped in with neoliberal structural adjustment and shock therapy after the Soviet Union collapsed into Eastern Europe, and that will become part of the story. But that doesn't change the fact that the United States really didn't want the Soviet Union to collapse, and if it could have prevented the Soviet Union from collapsing, it would have. Contrary to the narrative that you will be fed by Stalinists about how the West engineered the whole thing. So really, what the collapse of the Soviet Union represented was a decline in American power. The Soviet Union, throughout the Cold War, served the purpose of being a sub-imperialist for the United States. The agreement between it and the Soviet Union allowed the United States control over 2/3 of the world. With the Soviet Union gone, with their partner in crime gone, that control effectively no longer existed, at least what was left of that control. It had also eroded because of things like the Vietnam War and so forth. So as a result, you have a what you call a precipitate decline in U.S. power, U.S. geopolitical power. The United States, after the Second World War and throughout the Cold War, was the hegemon. It got its way with everybody else about 95% of the time. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that's no longer the case. And that's demonstrated when the United States tries to go into the Middle East and tries to intimidate pretty much everybody into doing what it wants. You know, we're hearing narrative about oil. You know, the United States went in to get oil. And even if that's part of it, that's not the whole, that's not really the main story. The main story is the United States was pursuing a neoconservative strategy. There were a lot of neoconservatives in Bush's administration. And of intimidation. The United States was going to flex its muscles and intimidate everybody into doing what it wanted because the neocons had observed that over successive administrations, the United States' power in the world had declined. and it didn't work. Nobody was intimidated, and so there is the kind of evidence that the United States' power and as hegemon has slipped away. Going back to Russia, the other side of the Cold War, Russia also experienced a precipitate decline, if you will, in its geopolitical power as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant that essentially Russia was returned to the very pitiful place that it inhabited in the world under the Tsar, maybe during the First World War or shortly before. So, and that place in the world was Russia was a military power. It had some economic power, but it had no real ability, no real sway in the what you call the interstate system, the hierarchy of states in the world system. And so this position for Russia is what world systems and analysts call a semi-peripheral position. Russia is in a mid-level spot in the world hierarchy of states, the interstate system, and to boot, it's not in a very high middle spot. It's higher than a lot of other people in the middle ranks, but it's lower than a lot of other people in the middle ranks, or a lot of other states, whatever you want to say there. But when with the construction of the Soviet Union and the Soviet victory over the Nazis in World War II and the Cold War, Russia still occupied a semi-peripheral position, but it was a much better semi-peripheral position. It was such that it was it was at the top in the middle slots in the interstate system. It was as many analysts say, it was the other superpower to rival the United States. When the Soviet Union collapses, the collapse and the ensuing neoliberal shock therapy and the loss of a lot of territory reduces Russia to the piddling place in the interstate system that it occupied before the Russian Revolution and before the Second World War. What you have is two states that are experiencing a precipitate decline in their power. They are losing geopolitical power in the world, and they can do not much to stop the loss of this power. So they're very, very desperate. The United States, for instance, is so desperate that it took on the disastrous wars in the Middle East. It recently pulled out of Afghanistan. I wrote something on my blog about that, which I would suggest you go read. And it couldn't even pull out of Afghanistan after 20 some odd years in an orderly fashion. It was a complete disaster, as you might say, a shit show. You have these states that are their power is declining and they are desperate. Okay, and that means that they're willing to do desperate things to make their share of the power go back up. Okay. I'll address something in the chat here. What about the Soviet system made the USSR more powerful? Well, again, the Soviet Union's place in the world was much better than the place in the world of the Tsarist Empire. In fact, the Soviet Union's place in the world before the Stalin era, particularly before the Second World War, was much worse than the Soviet Union's place in the world thereafter. Because the Soviet Union, being the United States' number two after the Second World War, meant that the Soviet Union was literally the United States' prison guard, if you will. It was the second, and this is widely said by mainstream commentators, it was the second world power at the time. So its position was just much better. And then the same person says, not going to lie, sounds like a conspiracy theory. Well, in terms of what I'm saying about the Cold War, so conspiracy theory is a kind of slippery word because it pretty much only has negative connotations. So conspiracy theory is what we say about something that we don't think is true. But if we're going to identify a kind of analysis that has the trappings of a conspiracy theory, then we're identifying a kind of analysis which assumes that world events are guided by shadowy or secret forces that are collaborating, right? Nothing in what I stated in the analysis that I'm presenting, and it's not my analysis, it's been done by Emanuel Wallerstein. Nothing in the analysis that I'm presenting requires the collaboration of secret forces. This is all just geopolitics and analysis of geopolitics, so it's not a conspiracy theory. But anyway, so now we're going to move on to the Ukrainian side of things. Okay. Let's just get a proper background picture up for you all. Okay. All right. So what we need to talk about next is Ukraine as it emerges from the Soviet Union after the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. When the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, it was a republic of the Soviet Union, a socialist republic of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, again, you had programs of structural adjustment and shock therapy financed by the West. And what all of that means is that you had experts from the West descending and international financial institutions, the European Reconstruction and Development Bureau, or European Bureau for Reconstruction and Development, or something like that, the EU financial institution, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, etc., these kinds of institutions, and experts from the West, economists, particularly neoclassical economists, descending on the former Soviet Union to carry out to carry out policies of making loans to the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, the former Soviet bloc, and stripping away all of the social services and making all of the state-owned industry privately owned. Particularly, something that was really important in this project was getting rid of price controls and allowing the market to set prices. And of course, the ideology behind this, as it always is well, this would deliver transition to free market democracy. Of course, it never dawns on any of these experts, even when they're criticizing their successive attempts at this project in the former Eastern Bloc, as they're critically evaluating the actions that they've taken so far, and criticizing each other. It never really dawns on these people that this idea of the free market democracy that they're chasing is kind of just illusory. So they're saying that the market that we need to get rid of bureaucratic planning, and we need to allow the market to operate without bureaucratic planning, and thus we also need to have democratic governance. But what these institutions and experts were actually doing is planning how the market would be introduced through the international financial institutions. I mean, how you bring all of these experts in to engineer this whole project, and you're not planning it. Kind of a contradiction in terms or in concept. And you're doing it not because the population wants that. You're doing it because you want that. The West wants that. That's what the West wants to do with the former territories of the Soviet Union, the former states of the Soviet Union. So it's very not democratic in that sense. Okay, so where does Ukraine? Well, and also something else that we have to mention is that so in the Soviet Union, the bureaucratic management of the Soviet economy created a class, and some people will debate me on whether it is a class. I think it is, so I will say class. There developed a class called the nomenklatura. That refers to basically the list of high officials from top to bottom that essentially directed everything in the Soviet Union, from the creation of laws to the carrying out of the economic plans and so forth. And so this was a bureaucratic class, effectively the ruling class of the Soviet Union. It was the class that controlled production. It was the class that controlled governance. So it was the ruling class of the Soviet Union. People will fight me on that and say, well, it wasn't a class, effectively because it was a state bureaucracy. And people have this notion that the state bureaucracy can't be a class. I think that's stupid, but we won't get into that debate. That's a technical debate. I may say some stuff about it in the article that I write on my blog, which you can watch out for. But I'll really be going into that in my book about communist regimes that I'm writing at the moment, which you can also keep an eye out for, and you can support me financially through the links in the description if you're interested in. So actually, I want to stop here for a second and ask Being if Being has anything to say.
Yeah, I just wanted you covered it a little bit, but I wanted to cover sort of my opinion on like the pro-Zelensky stuff that we're seeing in the online left space.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this is a lot of what we're seeing from people like Vosh and similar types who dominate the left in terms of social media on Twitter and YouTube, is we're seeing a co-option of the anti-fascist and broader anti-authoritarian movements, where instead of the anarchist perspective, which is usually pro-people opposed to states no matter who instigates who, which means that we support everybody to live free, to live free lives no matter state violence, and we don't play state politics, as in we don't participate in the international game of fascist hot potato I mentioned earlier, where we do this bolstering about how Ukraine is an anti-fascist state, which makes no sense. Even though I've said no state is fascist, it's really weird to pose it that way. And of course, on the other end, Russia as the bad fascist state. So yeah, and we see people like Vosh running laps and doing propaganda for Zelensky, giving the head of state praise, Ukrainian flag with bio, which again is just assimilating the anti-fascist struggle and making it safe for the system, where we, instead of a bottom-up movement where we focus on the people on the ground, we're just focusing on the combated state. And even to an absurd point was Vosh's coverage of a Ukrainian military ad where he said the ad was not nationalist. A military ad is somehow not nationalist, and the Ukrainian ad was trying to make a point that, like, oh, the military is comprised of just ordinary people trying to live their lives, and this is a justification for joining a government military. This is giving credence to the logistification of sovereignty, the interstate system, the nation state system, and the justification for any retaliatory action NATO presents against Russia. And again, it plays into this whole state, a lot of state games that people who are supposed to be libertarian socialists should just not play. And we should be taking the position of supporting people and never support governments or states. Again, no matter who instigates what. That's just my opinion on all that.
Yeah, I agree, and we'll get more into that as I explain the Ukrainian part of this. Comic-Con says, my comment about conspiracism was in response to your comment about the collaboration between the U.S. and USSR to maintain the Cold War. Yeah, I know. I'm saying that what I have to say about that is just geopolitics and geopolitical analysis. It has nothing to do with secret forces governing world events. It's just has nothing to do with conspiracy theories. Whether you disagree with it, I mean, you can disagree with it without it being a conspiracy theory, but then you have to provide some reason that it's wrong besides it's a conspiracy theory. Anyway. Okay. So, as I was saying about the nomenklatura ruling class in the Soviet Union, this ruling class, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the perestroika reforms implemented by Gorbachev, transformed into a class of oligarchs. Basically, people who took control of what was formerly state-controlled production for themselves and enriched themselves on it, and became very powerful ruling bloc in the former Soviet territories like Russia and Ukraine. And there's a lot of the most famous part of that is the criminal element, the illegal profiteering, and so forth. And that's going to play. It's going to play into what we talk about with Ukraine. But what you have to remember here is that that's not really the important part. The important part is the transformation of the former bureaucratic party state ruling class of the Soviet Union into capitalist or into more traditional and even more powerful than traditional capitalist tycoons. Okay, so we're looking at a list of Ukrainian presidents. These are the four that matter that we're going to talk about. Okay, so when the Soviet Union was dissolving, this guy Leonid Kravchuk, excuse my pronunciation, I'm very American, but he was the secretary of the Communist Party that was in control of the Ukrainian Republic and subordinate to Moscow. And what he did was essentially he just grafted the communist administration of Ukraine onto the new Ukrainian state that was becoming independent. The first president of Ukraine, once Ukraine has fully attained its independence, is Leonid Kuchma. And so Kravchuk and Kuchma are part of a specific block of the Ukrainian ruling class. So, what happens to the Ukrainian ruling class is the same thing that happens to the ruling class everywhere else in the dissolving Soviet Union. Again, the nomenclatura becomes the oligarchic ruling class. That's the case in Russia now. In fact, Putin is actually reaching out to the oligarchs to get support for the time of troubles that's going to come ahead from Russia because of the invasion, for Russia because of the invasion. And so that happens pretty much everywhere in the post-Soviet Union, and it happens in Ukraine. So there are two competing blocks of these oligarchs as Ukraine becomes independent, and they're concentrated in the East, because in the East you had the leading industries of the former Soviet Union, the profitable industries. And this is also where labor unrest is most common as the Soviet Union, and most effective as the Soviet Union is dissolving. Because, again, you have these concentrated, profitable industries that are pulling workers together in such a way that they can take solidaristic action among each other, in cooperation with each other. And they also have grievances that turn political very quickly when the Soviet Union is collapsing and in the aftermath of the collapse, because of how labor-intensive production is in these industries. Labor-intensive just meaning that, the workers who are working are doing very hard work. That's how things are run. This is in the east of Ukraine, specifically Donbass, and regions in Donbass, two in specific, Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk. And Donetsk is now one of the separatist republics. So in Dnipropetrovsk, again, excuse my pronunciation, and Donetsk, you have two opposing, competing oligarchic capitalist blocks. And so Kuchma, the first independent president, he is taken from the former I need to read this again because I can't. The Dnipropetrovsk block of former nomenclatura oligarchs, and that block controls Ukraine into the mid 90s. Okay, and then the Donetsk bloc starts effectively competing with the Dnipropetrovsk bloc. I really wish I spoke Russian at the moment. And that competition, and also the something that should be mentioned is the Dnipropetrovsk bloc is primarily former nomenclatura oligarchs. The Donetsk oligarchs are primarily a criminal element. So in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Union, there was a shadow economy. The Soviet Union was always geared toward production of productive resources and production for the military, not for consumers, which is why you had the cliques in the Soviet Union, the bread lines that you always hear about when you argue with somebody who doesn't like communism very much. To service these consumer needs and to kind of keep the Soviet economy afloat once rapid industrialization wasn't enough, and you had stagnation, particularly during the Brezhnev years. Brezhnev's circle and family were essentially mafioso. So the second shadow economy develops, basically just illegal economic activities. And so once the Soviet Union collapses and you have the neoliberal shock therapy, the activities of the shadow economy become legal. And so these mafioso go legitimate. They become legitimate tycoons of industry. Okay. And so the Donetsk faction of the competing oligarchic blocks is primarily composed of these criminal elements, especially since in that region, young people who, when the collapse created poverty and misery throughout Ukraine, as it did elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, these young people had nowhere to go, basically no other options, and so they turned to a life of crime and they organized clans, and they murdered each other, basically. And then when they murdered somebody, they would take any industrial or economic assets they owned, and they became basically corporations doing this. Maybe one of the most notorious of the clans was led by a guy called Alec the Greek. So that is the blocks, the ruling blocks that are competing, and that leads in 2004 to something called the Orange Revolution. Okay, and that becomes a conflict over the presidential election, particularly between these guys. Okay, Lukashenko and Yanukovych. Lukashenko represents the former nomenclatura bloc, and Yanukovych represents the criminal Donetsk bloc. In fact, Yanukovych spent time in prison, and during his time in prison, he actually, apparently, according to testimony of people that were in prison with him, he developed a rapport with the prison guards, and that gave him all these criminal connections. And so then when he went on to become an electrician, he went up from being an electrician to being a major oil tycoon. And so there's a conflict about the Ukrainian presidential election in the early 2000s between these guys and a movement that is a mass movement that is challenging the Ukrainian election. And that was basically a kind of actually Russian-style manipulation of the public using propaganda by the ruling power blocks. Something that needs to be recognized is that Ukraine basically just imported Russian propaganda. So the same type of what's called political technology propaganda that goes on in Russia where all the politics is just theater that's staged on TV, and you have funding of multiple sides by one ruling bloc group. That gets basically adopted by the Ukrainian elites after in the post-Soviet era. And so there's a lot of manipulation of the masses in the Ukrainian story leading up to the current conflict. And of course, Putin is still using that kind of political technology to maintain his autocracy, despite having, as Being was talking about, a formal parliamentary system. If you want to say some things about that, you can go ahead.
Officially multi-party,
yeah,
semi-presidency type government, where there's like a constitution and it's technically like a federation and all that, but but within these technicalities, does a bunch of authoritarianism and stuff. So, and it sort of blurs the line between exists between the line of a liberal democracy and outright authoritarian single party state. In Putin, the political space Putin builds exists between those 2 points, where he, while technically living in a republic with multi-party stuff, will conduct still plenty of abuses on those systems to carry out authoritarianism. So yeah, there's no Putin. There's no point for Putin to eliminate the other parties when he has control over the opposition. Any opposition that he doesn't have control over can be easily removed, and so there's no point or any reason why Putin needs to become fascist, or even like Othcon, which hasn't been a thing since like the 70s when Franco and Salazar died out.
Right.
So again, so Putin exists in what I'm considering a more like newer kind of politics that authoritarianism currently resides in, which is what academics call an illiberal democracy that blurs the line between these two positions and abuses the liberal order and stuff like that. Even like Orban, who's self-admitted to having a liberal democracy and admitted to building an illiberal state, used Russia as an example of what he wanted. So.
Right. Okay. Something that we should also mention is the process of nation, quote unquote, building in Ukraine. The idea behind the shock therapy was that along with transition to the free market, you have transition to democracy. Now, of course, no such thing happens. Ukrainian politics, it's not autocratic like Russia, like Russian politics is, but it's basically just theater for oligarchs. The elections really don't matter. I mean, not that they matter anywhere, but especially in Ukraine, really all the politics is just the theater that the oligarchs put on the TV for people to as propaganda to get them believing the narratives that favor the elites. And so that was one of the giant failures of the shock therapy. It failed in Russia too. I mean, even before Putin, you had Yeltsin, who sicked the army on the parliament building because he wanted to force them to go along with what he wanted. So, it wasn't necessarily Putin that led to the failure of the democratic process in Russia. It was kind of already a dead letter before him. In this process of nation building, central to the process of nation building, something that's been the central thing is how Ukraine is to create national identity. This was very important in the 19th century for the colonial states of Europe, when nationalism was effectively created. Nationalism was created by military parades and public education because you wanted to instill in the subjects of the state an identity with the state that gave them some rights as compared to those who were excluded by the coercive forces of the state, e.g., people in the colonies that Europe ruled at the time, and thus legitimate the power of the state. And so Ukraine has had a very slab shot process of national development, much more uneven and much more unsuccessful than its counterparts in the post-Soviet group of states, particularly because Ukraine doesn't have really a Russian history to draw on. It's always been kind of invaded by empires or controlled by empires, and then sometimes it would be independent, and then with the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, it gets dominated by Russia for hundreds of years. So there were two Ukrainian conceptions of nationalism. Okay, two uneasy conceptions of nationalism that were in part used to develop a Ukrainian national identity, insofar as they could be used to do that successfully. One was the monist conception of nationalism, which was that Ukraine should be one Ukrainian culture against the Russians. Okay, so this is not a pluralistic conception. This is just Ukrainians and their culture specifically against the Russians. And not only does that obviously breed xenophobia, but it's also just kind of impractical because of how much Ukrainian culture overlaps with Russian culture. I mean, there are a lot of Ukrainians for whom Russian is their first language. So it's not, this is something that's very hard to pursue. This idea of of Ukrainian monist national identity. The other conception was pluralist, kind of the opposite. While Ukrainians are, what defines Ukraine is its pluralism, a commonality with Russian culture, all different types of people, the melting pot. That's kind of hard, though, when it comes to developing a national identity, because if you're going to develop a national identity, you're going to need outgroups. And so these two conceptions of nationalism, with a lot of hurdles to actually becoming dominant and creating a Ukrainian national identity, has created this East-West conflict that's been exploited by Russia and the West in their machinations for the region, and that has allowed for the fighting between those defending the Ukrainian regime and those defending Russia's machinations and the separatist republics and so forth. And so there's this xenophobia that goes on between East and West in Ukraine that has allowed for the current situation to develop. And so despite the presence of political technology, that kind of propaganda in the early 2010s, 2013 to 14, there was something called the Maidan movement. Okay. So let's find a picture here. Okay, there you go. So there was the Maidan movement, and this was a mass movement of people that took to the streets in protest, citing grievances about what life was like under the regime. Okay, I mean, this is an impoverished, again, elite dominated regime. It's transitioned from the kind of neoliberal structural adjustment and shock therapy like the rest of the world has towards basically just debt economics, taking on debt to pay for all of the needed functions of the economy, and but nonetheless still carrying out austerity. So, gutting whatever public services and power of labor people that there actually is in Ukraine. And so people took to the streets in the Maidan movement, citing these grievances, and part of those grievances were, wanting to join the EU, and that's been part of the Ukrainian story since the post-Soviet situation developed. Ukrainians kind of just want to drift away or maybe run away from Russia. But that was only a small part of the grievances. This movement really represented people who were just fed up with the Ukrainian regime. And that movement, of course, led to the current fighting, principally between forces backed by Russia and forces of the Ukrainian regime. And so that protest movement got kind of transformed into this conflict by the activities of Russia and the West, NATO, and EU expansion into the former Russian territory, and Russia wanting to restore some of the power that it has lost from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so really what you have in Ukraine is you have basically a failed project of neoliberalism that has deteriorated as the current structural crisis of the world system, and this is something I will talk about more in the article that I write, has gone on. And now it's been essentially hijacked by two states that are experiencing precipitate decline in their political power. And that's why Russia invaded. Russia is desperate. It's experienced a decline in its political power, and it wants to do something to restore that. This is basically, it's the same reason the United States invades the Middle East in the early 2000s. So yeah, that's kind of what I have to say about this. In terms of a position that the international left may take, I think the position of the international left can only be that of internationalism and anti-militarism. Basically, we reject fighting under any elite forces, and we aim to construct an international movement that struggles against all elite forces to abolish all of the states that currently rule the world and are running it into the ground. So that is the only position that makes sense to me. The position of backing Russia is just the position of backing a state in the capitalist world system desperately trying to hold on to power. That has got nothing to do with the goals of social transformation and creating a human society. That has nothing, it's just completely immaterial to what should be the goals of the left. Accordingly, backing the Ukrainian regime is completely immaterial to those goals, because the dilapidated elitist regime in Ukraine is what created this crisis in the first place. I mean, everybody, the media and even leftists want to focus on the geopolitics. They want to focus on NATO versus Russia. But the real focus is the failure of the regime in Ukraine as a neoliberal project, as a project of shock therapy and structural adjustment in the post-Soviet landscape. They're supporting the regime is basically just supporting the same elitist structure that has led to this debacle in the first place. This is why I don't have sympathy for this idea that we need to line up behind Zelensky and put Ukrainian flags in our Twitter usernames. It's nonsense. I mean, again, the so-called leftists, when they should be pointing out the futility of backing any forces of elite power, they are lapping up the support for elite power. It's ridiculous. So really, again, the only position to take here is internationalism and anti-militarism and revolutionary humanism. Yeah, that is it for, I think, what I want to say. Do you want to say anything, Being?
Yeah, I guess I just want to leave it off with saying that it's funny to sort of try to, again, pose any of these states as fascist. I mean, the National Corps, the breakaway neo-Nazis from the Azov Battalion, have their own philosophy of trying to sever ties with both Russia and the West, EU and NATO, and create a new intermarium superstate. The intermarium was an old geopolitical plan to recreate the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and to remind everyone, this party got 2% in the one election to try to go for. So,
right,
I think a lot of
the national corps is basically like the most marginal of the marginal in terms of Ukrainian politics. They didn't even last election. They didn't even get any seats. So,
yeah, I think I just sort of wanted to remind everyone how marginal and still marginalized fascism is in the post-war era, and to not think of this conflict in terms of the game of hot potato I keep trying to remind everybody of.
Right. Yeah, and so that's it. I encourage you to check out Post-Comprehension's content. Link is in the description. Also in the description is my blog, where you can look out for an article that I will be posting in the coming weeks, dealing with the Ukraine crisis in more detail than I've dealt with it here. This is just a kind of overview that I've given you, along with some of Being's analysis of what role fascism plays, if any, in this issue. So yeah, see you guys next video. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. See ya next time.